The rain had fallen across central Florida for 2 straight days, dragging a gray curtain over highways, motels, and citrus groves that seemed to rot under the weight of it. On a narrow road just outside Daytona, a police cruiser idled under the dripping branches of live oak trees. Inside, Detective Henry Mallard thumbed through stapled investigative notes, each page heavy with the same name that had been circulating for months: Aileen Wuornos. She was everywhere now, on TV reports, on scattered police bulletins, in whispered conversations between law enforcement agencies. A strange, volatile storm of a woman, a drifter, a sex worker, a survivor, a killer. The stories about her shifted like fog. One moment she was a woman battling demons born in a brutal childhood. Another moment she was the woman the media was calling America's first female serial killer. The truth was harder to find. In the humid stillness, Mallard exhaled. The last photograph he'd stared at showed the abandoned Pontiac belonging to Peter Siems, crashed, wiped down, left like a metallic corpse on the edge of a wooded lot. Witnesses had described 2 women stumbling from the smoldering vehicle, one tall with tangled blonde hair and the other shorter, dark-haired, moving with frantic urgency. He knew those descriptions already. Everyone did. The tall one was Aileen. The shorter one, the one who seemed nervous even in witness memory, was Tyria Moore, Aileen's girlfriend, roommate, companion, and in some ways, the beating heart of why this case had spiraled into something far stranger than the typical trail of violence. As thunder rolled across the sky, Mallard folded the file shut. There were murders, yes, a string of them. Men left dead in woods, in ditches, in secluded spaces where the air smelled of pine sap and gunpowder. But beneath the crime scene photographs, there were voice recordings that the detectives kept replaying. Recordings of love, fear, confession, and contradictions, so intense they felt like 2 different people speaking through the same throat. I killed them to survive. I killed them to rob them. I killed them because I loved her so much. The truth, Mallard knew, would take far more than evidence. It would take understanding the storm inside the woman herself. Aileen's story, the one she gave to the world, to Tyria, to investigators, to the cameras that came later, always began with desperation. Not simple poverty, but something darker and deeper. A loneliness that had followed her from childhood like a cracked shadow. When she first arrived in Daytona, she carried everything she owned in a battered bag and walked with the defensive tilt of someone expecting cruelty around every corner. The bars she drifted through, biker bars, roadside dives, places where men with rough hands and sharp eyes gathered, became temporary shelters. Sometimes she slept in the woods, sometimes in abandoned cars, sometimes in the arms of strangers who paid without looking her in the face. And then she met Tyria. It wasn't the way films later portrayed it, the shy girl, the wide-eyed innocence, the forbidden bloom of unexpected romance. In real life, Tyria Moore was steady, grounded, practical. She was openly gay, comfortable in her skin in a way Aileen admired and envied. They met in a bar thick with cigarette smoke, where the jukebox played old country songs that bled sadness. Tyria was a motel maid then, not wealthy, not helpless, not sheltered. A woman used to surviving in her own way. But she had something Aileen had never truly known: stability. And Aileen fell in love with her with the kind of wild, consuming urgency that frightened even herself. For 4.5 years they built a life. A ramshackle one, yes, built on odd jobs, motel rooms, cheap beer, shared cigarettes, and whispered promises. But a life that Aileen clung to as though it was the only real home she had ever known. If she worked the highways, it was for them. If she fought men who threatened her, it was because she needed to come home alive to Tyria. If she carried a gun, it wasn't, as the film monster implied, because she was already halfway toward killing herself. It was because she believed every night on the road was a coin flip between survival and disappearance. "The only reason I carried that darn gun," she once said in a recorded interview, voice cracking, is because I loved her so much. I wanted to make sure I got home alive, to be another day breathing with her. By 1990, the police were circling a pattern. Men vanished, their cars surfaced, their wallets emptied. Their bodies appeared in the scrublands east of the interstate, shot multiple times, often dumped with their pants half open or pockets turned out. A retired Air Force major, a former police chief, a man who had worked in child protection, a trucker, a merchant seaman, some ordinary, some with quiet histories, one with a badge once pinned to his chest. Florida was no stranger to crime, but this string of killings had a strange echo to them. Aileen's palm print on a window, her handwriting on a pawn slip, a .22 caliber revolver that ballistics later connected to multiple murders, hidden near Rose Bay, where the tide whispered against broken shells and rotting driftwood. The crashes, the sightings, the fear, all of it was tightening around the woman who had once tried to build a life out of cigarette smoke and motel sheets. But the part the newspapers loved, the part they printed with hungry fascination, was the romance. The two women, the composite sketch, the whispered idea of a killer couple drifting through Florida like ghosts. Truth was stranger and quieter than that. Tyria was not a partner in crime. She was not beside Aileen when the shots were fired. Court documents, recordings, and the documentary all pointed to the same reality. While their lives were entwined, the violence belonged to Aileen alone. And yet, one day, after the police came knocking, Tyria made a choice that would define everything that came after. She cooperated. She let investigators record her calls. She played the role of frightened lover to a woman who, even in jail, still clung to her with the desperation of a drowning child clutching a life vest. On the recordings, 10 calls in all, Aileen's voice trembled. "If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble," she told Tyria, "I will." The betrayal, if that word fit, was complicated. Tyria later testified in court. She led police to the weapon. She told them what she knew. But she also saved herself. And Aileen understood that, at least at first. The day Aileen was arrested at the last resort, the biker bar coated in years of spilled beer, cigarette burns, and ghost stories, the sky was a hard, unbroken blue. She stood outside with a man the film monster later fictionalized, a soft-spoken older regular named Thomas. In real life, Thomas didn't exist. No records, no witness statements, no documentary footage mentioned him. But people liked to imagine she had had a friend there. What she actually had was the watchful presence of undercover officers waiting for the right moment. When they grabbed her arms and pinned them behind her back, Aileen didn't fight. She looked skyward as though searching for Tyria, for mercy, or perhaps for the version of herself she had been before everything began to unravel. Cameras clicked. Somewhere far away, court documents were already collecting dust that would one day be used to sentence her to die. The darkness that followed wasn't a straight path. Aileen spoke in contradictions, rage, grief, bitterness. Some days she insisted she killed only in self-defense, that men had attacked her, beaten her, tried to rape her, that she had fired to save her life. Other days, she said, "I killed those men and robbed them as cold as ice." On death row, the walls pressed in on her. She was interviewed by Dateline, by artists, by journalists, by people who wanted to understand her and by people who only wanted spectacle. Her childhood friend, Dawn Botkins, visited often. Dawn listened to the spirals of Aileen's mind, to her shifting stories, to the way she carried both trauma and fury like twin weights dragging her under. One evening, in words Dawn never forgot, Aileen told her. She said she was definitely a serial killer. She killed to rob, she robbed to kill, period. Dawn had sat there, heartbreaking, knowing that the truth, whatever it was, had devoured the woman she once knew. Outside the prison, life went on. Bars replaced their neon signs. The last resort became a grim tourist attraction where bikers drank near a handwritten sign marking where she was arrested. Documentaries re-examined the case. Films romanticized or dramatized her. People argued over whether she was a monster, a victim, or something disturbingly in between. But inside, as the years rolled by, Aileen became quieter. Her love for Tyria remained a scar she couldn't stop touching. Her stories shifted with her moods. Some nights she cried for the girl she once was. Other nights she raged against the world that had shaped her with neglect and cruelty. And sometimes she simply sat still, staring at the concrete floor as though she could see her past playing out in the patterns. On October 9, 2002, she walked to the execution chamber as though stepping off the final edge of a long, jagged cliff. She was 46 years old, haunted by memories, contradictions, and the heavy truth that once she began pulling the trigger, she never stopped. People would argue about her for decades. They would debate whether the first killing was truly survival, whether the man had attacked her, or whether that was the story she needed to survive telling herself. They would rewind the tapes, rewatch the footage, rebuild the narrative in courtroom documentaries and police documentaries and Netflix documentaries that tried to search for the woman beneath the myth. But one thing remained clear through every recording, every confession, every shifting version of the truth. Aileen Wuornos had been shaped by violence long before she ever committed it. And once the cycle broke fully open, there was no turning back. The early Florida mornings carried a damp chill that clung to the skin like a warning. Aileen's life had become a series of mornings like this, heavy, suffocating, full of ghosts that refused to leave. Even in the sunlight, the shadows followed her. Her steps along Daytona's streets were cautious, measured, as if the asphalt itself might betray her. Each motel room, each cigarette-smoked bar, each encounter with a man who wanted to pay her for a few hours of her body, felt like walking a thin line between survival and something darker, something she knew she could not always control. Aileen had learned to read men quickly. Some were desperate, some cruel, some careless, all predictable in small ways. Yet the patterns only provided temporary safety. Once, a man had grabbed her roughly, thinking she was just another body to be used and discarded. That night she had thought of Tyria, of the tiny apartment they shared, the quiet routines that were her anchor. She had thought of how fragile that world was. The gun was in her bag, hidden, a weight she carried against every threat, every fear. It was love, yes, but also a constant, simmering edge of anxiety. By 1989, the first killings began. Richard Mallory, a man she later admitted to shooting, had approached her on the side of a quiet road. He was older, imposing, with eyes that reminded her too much of men who had hurt her before. She claimed self-defense, but in the tangled truth of her mind, fear, anger, survival, and desperation collided. One bullet, then another. And then the realization. She had crossed a line from which there was no turning back. Her methods were simple, coldly practical. She targeted men she met while working the highways, particularly those who seemed threatening or vulnerable in ways she could exploit. Some had histories in law enforcement or the military, men who should have been careful, but who were careless in ways Aileen recognized. She would lure them, drive them to secluded areas, confront them. Sometimes it was survival, sometimes it was revenge, sometimes it was something darker still. The mixture of anger, fear, and adrenaline that twisted into an almost mechanical process. By the time the bodies were found, sometimes days later, Aileen had vanished into the humid, forgiving landscape of Florida, leaving only fingerprints, palm prints, and traces of a life that existed outside the law. Yet there was Tyria. Through all of it, Tyria remained a constant. In ways that no one outside their private world could understand, she kept Aileen tethered to some fragment of humanity. The calls Tyria made, recorded by the police, were more than evidence, they were lifelines. In the dim light of jail visitation rooms, Aileen's voice could soften. She could confess, lament, cry over fears and insecurities, reveal a raw vulnerability that no one else saw. "I was so worried," she told Tyria in one call, voice tight with fear. I was so worried we were going to lose our place. I know it sounds crazy, but it's the truth." Love, as it had always done, complicated the narrative. It made her human, and that humanity clashed violently with the brutality of her acts. Tyria understood, in ways law enforcement never could, that Aileen's violence was entwined with desperation and fear. Yet the world outside had no interest in nuance. They wanted monsters or victims. They wanted clear lines. Aileen offered neither. The crash of Peter Siems' Pontiac was one of the incidents that later cemented Aileen in public consciousness. Witnesses had seen two women staggering from the wrecked vehicle, wiping it down. A palm print inside the car matched Aileen, but Peter's body never surfaced. The ambiguity haunted investigators. Did he survive? Was he gone? In Aileen's mind, the man was a threat neutralized, and yet there was the flicker of guilt that no one would ever measure, because only she knew how close she had come to becoming lost in that same wreck. Police soon drew a composite sketch that included two women, Aileen and Tyria. The image was broadcast statewide, a grim illustration of the do that terrified local law enforcement. But the reality was complicated. Tyria was not a killer. She had been present, yes, but only as a witness to Aileen's life, sometimes knowing, sometimes not. She had loved Aileen and had lived in the shadows of her chaos, yet she had maintained a moral and practical separation from the acts that left men dead. This duality between public perception and private truth became a defining theme. On one hand, Aileen's crimes were clear, documented, and horrifying. On the other, the stories told about her, in tabloids, documentaries, and even films, often blurred lines, crafting a narrative of romance, compulsion, and tragedy that sometimes diverged from reality. One of the few elements that remained consistent across retellings was the presence of fear and vulnerability. Aileen carried a gun not out of eagerness to kill, but because of a lifetime conditioned to anticipate danger. She survived by violence because the world had left her few other options. Every murder, every escape, every whispered confession was a strategy for continued existence, no matter how morally fraught it was. Even in court, this contradiction emerged. She would claim self-defense in one statement, acknowledging a life lived in reaction to threat, while admitting in another coldly, "I killed those men and robbed them as cold as ice." The tension between human vulnerability and criminal action became almost unbearable to parse. It was a psychological tightrope that she balanced every moment of every day. Her first recorded confessions, when Tyria allowed police to record their conversations, revealed a side the public rarely saw. There was not only love but also a constant negotiation with morality. She feared Tyria's arrest, feared losing her anchor. "If I have to confess everything just to keep you from getting in trouble, I will," she had told Tyria, a confession framed by care, attachment, and terror, not simply guilt or remorse. Aileen's days became regimented once in custody. Her life outside ceased to exist, leaving only a small, dimly lit cell, the echoing footsteps of guards, and the occasional visit from lawyers, journalists, and childhood friends. Dawn Botkins, her oldest friend, often came. Dawn had grown up alongside Aileen, knowing the cruel early experiences, the violence that shaped her, and the relationships that had both saved and doomed her. Dawn understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the fragility and intensity coexisting in the woman who had become infamous. There were interviews with reporters, broadcast across television networks, capturing Aileen's shifting moods, fury, grief, humor, resignation. Each statement seemed to contradict the last. One day she would laugh at the absurdity of her situation. Another day she would cry, whispering fears of abandonment and loneliness that mirrored her childhood traumas. Every word, every pause, every hesitation revealed a psychological landscape both terrifying and heartbreaking. And through it all, Tyria remained a central, complicated figure. Their partnership, lasting 4.5 years, was marked by intimacy, loyalty, and profound tension. Tyria had been forced into choices no person should face, cooperating with law enforcement, testifying in court, revealing secrets of the woman she loved. Yet her actions were not betrayal in the cold sense. They were survival. They were pragmatism shaped by fear and love intertwined. It was this tension that the media could never capture fully. Films and documentaries attempted to portray Selby Wall or Tyria Moore as simplified characters, naive, dependent, emotionally swept away. But reality was grayer, harsher, more nuanced. Tyria was no helpless victim. She was a witness, a partner in intimacy, a moral observer of acts she could not condone, and yet could not entirely escape. Even as the police investigation tightened, Aileen's psychological state wavered. She reflected on the trajectory of her life, the men she had killed, and the relationships she had built. Memories of her early life, unstable homes, exploitation, abuse, flickered like shadowed corners in her mind. She remembered being discarded by adults, abandoned by guardians, and forced into a world where survival meant navigating danger at every turn. She carried these memories with her into adulthood, and they had shaped every desperate choice she made. By the time of her trial, Aileen had been linked to 6 murders and confessed to a 7th. The evidence was overwhelming, yet the nuances of her story, her motivations, her fear, her love for Tyria, her claimed self-defense became points of fascination, moral debate, and storytelling. Psychologists debated her mental state. Journalists speculated endlessly. The public oscillated between horror, sympathy, fascination, and revulsion. In interviews with NBC Dateline and artists like Jasmine Hurst, Aileen reflected on her life with unflinching honesty. She spoke of survival, of love, of fear, of rage. She admitted acts that were inexcusable and confessed emotions that were deeply human. The contrast between brutality and vulnerability became almost unbearable to witness. She was both villain and victim, predator and lover, cold-blooded killer and desperate, broken human being. Through Tyria, through Dawn, through recordings and court filings, the story of Aileen Wuornos became less about sensationalized murders and more about a life shaped by violence, neglect, and love. Each killing was a marker, a moment when survival collided with morality, and each confession revealed both fear and affection, the struggle to hold on to humanity even as she committed acts that society could never forgive. The days blurred into months. Investigators pored over files, photographs, and testimony. The media spun narratives of romance, horror, and criminal genius. Documentaries and films would later embellish or compress events, creating villains or tragic antiheroes depending on the story they wanted to tell. The public could not see the private toll, the love that had anchored her, the fear that had driven her, the relentless sense of being hunted, not only by law enforcement but by the echoes of her past. Aileen knew that every moment was a negotiation with fate. The gun she carried, the decisions she made, the love she expressed, all were bound up in the same desperate drive to survive in a world that had shown her cruelty from the start. Her story became a mirror, reflecting both the horrors that shaped her and the brutal consequences of living in a society unprepared to understand a woman like her. Aileen's life behind bars became a chamber of mirrors. Each reflection she saw in the cold steel of her cell, in the eyes of guards, in courtrooms, and in the cameras that watched her was fractured. One part of her remembered childhood neglect and abandonment. Another part remembered love and tenderness. Another part remembered the sting of adrenaline and fear that had accompanied each killing. She existed simultaneously as predator and prey, human and myth, desperate to hold onto the fragments of life she had known. The prison walls were thick, unyielding, yet they contained only her body. Her mind remained untethered, replaying past events with the vividness of a nightmare she could never wake from. She remembered the first time she met Tyria, the cigarette smoke swirling around them, the jukebox playing a sorrowful country song, and the immediate, intense connection she felt. Tyria had been the one person who seemed to anchor her, to offer stability in the chaos of her existence. But that anchor came with its own tension. The love she felt was intertwined with fear, with the knowledge that the violent, chaotic part of herself could shatter everything she held dear. Tyria had cooperated with the police. She had made the calls that would eventually lead investigators to Aileen, and she had helped recover the weapon that tied Aileen to multiple killings. The reality of Tyria's actions, pragmatic, necessary, born of love and fear, was far more complex than films and media portrayals. In the public imagination, Tyria was often rendered as a passive figure, swept up in Aileen's storm. In reality, she was a witness, a partner, and a moral anchor in a life otherwise consumed by violence. Aileen's confessions, often contradictory, revealed a deep, haunting complexity. On one recording, she claimed self-defense, framing the killings as necessary acts to preserve her own life. On another, she admitted to cold-blooded robbery, describing her actions with a chilling detachment. "I killed those men and robbed them as cold as ice." The tension between these statements reflected the duality of her existence. A woman shaped by trauma, seeking love and stability, yet capable of acts of unimaginable violence. Her interactions with journalists and artists, including the 1997 interview with Jasmine Hurst, offered glimpses into her psyche. She spoke candidly about the fear that had guided her life, the desperation that had driven her actions, and the love that had anchored her. She spoke of survival in a world that had offered her little else, revealing a woman both profoundly human and terrifyingly dangerous. Through these interviews, the public could see the contours of a life shaped by pain and circumstance, though filtered through the lens of media fascination. The legal proceedings were a relentless examination of Aileen's life and actions. Courtrooms became stages where her contradictions were laid bare. Psychologists debated her mental state. Prosecutors highlighted her calculated actions. Defense attorneys emphasized trauma and self-preservation. The narrative was a battle between the need to punish and the desire to understand, between societal outrage and the human desire for comprehension. Throughout it all, Aileen's bond with Tyria remained a central, complex element. Their love was not romanticized in its entirety. It was fraught with fear, tension, and moral ambiguity. Tyria's cooperation with law enforcement, though necessary for her own survival, placed her in a position of immense emotional complexity. She was a witness to the life of a woman she loved, forced to navigate a labyrinth of loyalty, fear, and legal obligation. The dynamic between the two women added layers of emotional depth to a story that was often reduced to headlines and sensationalized portrayals. Aileen's narrative also intersected with the lives of her victims, each with their own histories and complexities. Men who had served in law enforcement, the military, and other positions of authority became part of a grim catalog of violence. The media often reduced them to numbers or archetypes, obscuring their individuality. The Netflix documentary, in particular, focused more on Aileen's perspective, highlighting the psychological and emotional dimensions of her actions while skimming the life stories of those she killed. This narrative choice emphasized the human complexity of the killer, even as it grappled with the moral and ethical implications of her actions. As the trial progressed, Aileen's public image became increasingly complicated. She was portrayed as a monster, a victim, a survivor, and a romanticized figure, depending on the storyteller. The film Monster later dramatized her life, introducing fictional elements such as Selby Wall and the character Thomas, which simplified and reshaped the narrative for cinematic purposes. In reality, the story was messier, richer, and darker, a tapestry of trauma, love, desperation, and violence that defied easy categorization. The death row experience was a crucible of reflection and reckoning. Aileen confronted her actions, her past, and the inexorable consequences of her life choices. She oscillated between moments of anger, grief, and resignation. Conversations with Dawn Botkins revealed both self-awareness and stark admission. She recognized herself as a serial killer, acknowledging the calculated and deliberate nature of her actions. Yet, interwoven with this recognition was a persistent thread of fear, vulnerability, and longing for connection. As the execution date approached, Aileen's story reached its tragic and inevitable conclusion. On October 9, 2002, she walked to the chamber 46 years old, carrying with her the weight of a lifetime of trauma, violence, and complex human emotion. The lethal injection marked the end of her physical existence, yet her story continued to resonate through documentaries, films, and public discourse. The complexities of her life, the love, the fear, the violence, the survival, persisted, challenging simplistic notions of morality and criminality. The aftermath of Aileen's execution prompted reflection and debate. Scholars, journalists, and the public grappled with the duality of her existence, a woman shaped by early abuse and systemic neglect, capable of extraordinary violence, yet deeply human in her motivations and emotional landscape. The ethical and psychological dimensions of her life became subjects of ongoing analysis, exploring the interplay between circumstance, trauma, and choice. Documentaries such as Aileen, Queen of the Serial Killers, revisited her life with greater depth and nuance, utilizing court records, archival footage, and interviews to present a more comprehensive portrait. The series emphasized the psychological and emotional underpinnings of her actions, highlighting the intersections of love, fear, and survival that defined her life. By contrasting Aileen's reality with dramatized portrayals, these documentaries illuminated the tension between myth and fact, providing a more textured understanding of one of America's most notorious female killers. Even years later, the story of Aileen Wuornos continued to evoke a complex mixture of horror, empathy, and fascination. She became a symbol of the interplay between societal failure and individual action, a case study in how trauma and circumstance can shape human behavior in extreme ways. The love she shared with Tyria, the confessions she made to investigators, and the moments of vulnerability revealed in interviews all contributed to a narrative that transcended simple categorizations of good and evil. Aileen's legacy also sparked broader discussions about gender, violence, and the criminal justice system. As one of the first widely recognized female serial killers in the United States, her case challenged assumptions about women's capacity for violence and the societal narratives that often obscure the complexities of female criminality. Scholars examine how media portrayals, public perceptions, and legal interpretations intersected with the realities of her life, highlighting the ways in which Aileen's story defied conventional expectations. Throughout all retellings, the emotional and psychological dimensions of her experience remained central. The recordings of her calls with Tyria, her interviews with journalists and artists, and the testimonies of friends like Dawn Botkins offered glimpses into the human heart behind the headlines. These narratives revealed a woman who was capable of extraordinary love and deep fear, whose life was marked by survival and desperation, and whose actions reflected both the impact of trauma and the agency of choice. In the end, Aileen Wuornos was a figure of contradictions, a lover and a killer, a survivor and